Lecture 15. Seeing Through Other Eyes, Point of View.
As I said in my earlier lectures about character, fiction gives us access to the consciousness of other people. This is just another way of saying that fiction allows us to see the world from someone else's point of view. Point of view is just as fundamental to fiction as character and plot. It's hard, if not impossible, to imagine a work of fiction without any characters in it, and by the same token, it's pretty much impossible to imagine a work of fiction that has no point of view. Even the most remote third-person narrative, which watches human behavior without judgment as if through a security camera, is a particular point of view. Just as there are different ways to create character or structure a plot, there are a wide variety of points of view. There's the imperial, godlike third person of the great 19th century authors such as George Eliot or Leo Tolstoy. There's the intimate, limited third person of a high modernist novel like Mrs. Dalloway, shifting from one character to the next. Or there's the distinctive first person of books as different from each other as Jane Eyre, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Heart of Darkness, Lolita, or Housekeeping. Choosing a point of view is not just about deciding whether to use the third person or the first person. Choosing a point of view also determines the style and tone of the narration, specifically the quality that writers call voice. Think about a favorite novel or short story, especially one that is narrated in the first person, and I'll bet that what you remember mainly is the narrator's voice. Long after most of us have forgotten the plot details of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we remember the sly, slangy voice of Huck himself. We remember Jane Eyre's grit and restrained passion. We remember Humbert Humbert's creepy erudition in Lolita. Each one of these individual voices not only evokes the character who is telling the story, it also determines the tone, sensibility, and moral stance of the narrative. Jane Eyre's decency and stubborn determination aren't just a reflection of her own personality. They represent Charlotte Bronte's view of what people are like and how the world works. It's important to remember that Mark Twain is not Huck Finn, and that Charlotte Bronte is not Jane Eyre, and that Nabokov is not Humbert Humbert. In the next lecture, I'll talk more about the double consciousness of the first-person narrator. It's even possible for a writer to create a first-person narrator who may not be telling the truth, the way Eudora Welty does in her short story, Why I Live at the P.O. I'll also talk about that technique known as an unreliable narrator in the next lecture. But as distinctive as a first-person narration can be, it's not as if first-person narrators have all the fun. A third-person narration can have as distinctive a voice as a first-person narrator. One of the great hallmarks of a great author, in fact, is the way his or her distinctive voice can become another character in the narrative, even if that voice isn't actually participating in the story. You can't read Dickens, for example, without coming away with a vivid impression of the author himself, even when he's writing in the third person, maybe even especially when he's writing in the third person. His great novel, Bleak House, is written in both the first and the third person, and you can't read it without getting a vivid idea of which characters Dickens approves of and which ones he doesn't. It's clear what makes Dickens angry, what makes him laugh, and what he thinks is the moral thing to do. His unique view of humanity, expressed with his boundless energy, is present on every page. George Eliot's great novel Middlemarch is written in the third person, but it also features frequent comments directly from the author. As a result, when you read Middlemarch, you're not only following the characters in the story, you're engaging with one of the sharpest and least sentimental intellects in English literature. And if you read Bleak House and Middlemarch one right after the other, and that's a lot of reading because they are both great big books, you can see right away that you could never mistake Eliot's voice for Dickens's or vice versa. As I keep reminding you throughout these lectures, writing fiction is all about making choices. When it comes to point of view, you have to decide whether your story will be told by someone in the story or by an outside narrator. You also have to decide what voice that character or that narrator is going to use. Choosing a point of view and a voice not only determines the perspective from which the story and the plot are viewed, it also determines which characters you include and how you depict them, as well as what actually happens in the narrative. Choosing a point of view is one of the most important decisions you will make. In this lecture, I want to take a quick tour of the most important types of point of view. Then, in the next two lectures, we'll look at the first-person point of view and then the third-person point of view in more detail. I have found that it sometimes helps to think of point of view as something literal, as a way of looking at a landscape, for example. Imagine your setting as an actual landscape with plains, mountains, valleys, forests, and deserts. Your story is what happens to your characters as they move across this landscape. Let's think of the different types of point of view as actual points along the curve of the sky arching over the story, from the highest point overlooking the entire landscape to the lowest point, right down at ground level, where a character or a narrator can only see what's directly in front of him or her. Let's start with the third-person point of view. As we'll discover in more detail in a subsequent lecture, there are different types of third person. The most all-inclusive variety is the third-person omniscient point of view, right at the zenith of our metaphorical sky. This is the point of view in which the author and the narrator seem to be more or less the same person, though that's not necessarily the case. As John Gardner puts it, the omniscient narrator is a persona of the author. Whether or not this narrator is the same person as the author, this sort of narration sees all and is capable of revealing everything there is to know about the characters. This point of view is often called godlike because the narration is like an all-powerful, all-knowing deity who can not only see the entire landscape beneath, but into the hearts and minds of its characters. This type of narration can place a character in her historical, political, and social context at the same time, as it can reveal her most intimate secrets. This variety of the third-person point of view is often associated with the 19th century, when it was used without irony by such great writers as George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy. With the rise of modernism and postmodernism, the omniscient point of view came to be used more ironically. Even so, it was the point of view that dominated fiction right through the middle of the 20th century, often in large-scale novels that have a lot of characters and often evoke whole communities. A good example is Paula Marshall's The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, an epic novel about life on a Caribbean island which was published in 1969. More recently, Jonathan Franzen, in his novels The Corrections and Freedom, has adopted a godlike point of view. So has the British novelist Nicola Barker in her novel Darkmans, which depicts the members of a community even as it enters into the consciousness of its characters as intimately as Mrs. Dalloway does. A little closer to the ground along our curve of sky, but still pretty high up, is the third-person objective point of view. We've already encountered a good example of this point of view in Dashiell Hammett's detective novel, The Maltese Falcon. As I said when we were discussing this novel earlier, the interesting thing about the point of view of The Maltese Falcon is that we see and hear everything each character does, but we never get inside their heads. The omniscient third person of Tolstoy or Eliot can dip into the heads of an individual character like Anna Karenina or Dorothea Brooke and inhabit her consciousness for a time, showing us what she is thinking and feeling. But the objective third person is more like a video camera. It records and reports everything it sees, but it doesn't tell us anything about the character's private feelings, thoughts, or motivations. This point of view may even be the most lifelike one. After all, we can't read the minds of other people in real life, and the objective point of view reproduces what it feels like as we try to guess from their speech, actions, and gestures what other people around us are thinking. But even though it's more lifelike than the third-person omniscient, it's also a colder point of view because it cannot engage intimately with the minds of its characters. Now, moving down along the dome of our imaginary sky, we find a spot about halfway down, midway between the omniscient third person and the most intimate first-person narration. This point of view is known as the close third person or the limited third person. More recently, it has also come to be known as free indirect discourse. In the close third person, the narration uses third-person pronouns such as he, she, and they instead of first-person pronouns such as I or we. And like the omniscient third person, it gets inside the heads of its characters. But in the limited third person, the whole story or novel is generally told from the point of view of only one character. John Updike, for example, used the close third person in his series of 4 novels about the life of Harry Rabbit Angstrom. These novels are written in the third person, but they are mainly told from the point of view of Rabbit himself. The close third person, in fact, is the default mode of much contemporary fiction. But the close third person doesn't have to be limited to one character. Often, writers will alternate the points of view between several characters within the same narrative, the way Toni Morrison does in Beloved. William Faulkner's Light in August also shifts between several different point of view characters, all of them expressed in the third person. In fact, the close third person point of view can easily turn into the omniscient third person. Much of George Eliot's Middlemarch, for example, is written from the point of view of one character or another, but Eliot often shifts into the omniscient point of view, often within a chapter or even within a paragraph. However, the traditional omniscient third person is usually more remote from its characters and capable of making sweeping judgments about society or whole classes of people. For whatever reason, modern novels written in the more intimate, close third person tend to shy away from those kinds of judgments. Still, the close third person allows the author to pull back the camera if he wants to. It allows him to comment directly on the action or to show us something the point of view character can't or doesn't know. Moving further down the curve of the sky, the close third person shades into what you might call the objective first person. Like the close third person, which uses third-person pronouns to limit itself to the perspective of one character, the objective first person is a hybrid point of view. It uses the first-person pronoun I, but still maintains a certain distance from the action of the narrative. In other words, in the objective first person, the story or novel is being narrated by a fictional character, but one who either plays only a minor part in the story or isn't actually present in the story at all. 2 good examples are Ishmael in Moby Dick and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. In much of Moby Dick, Ishmael acts mainly as a recording eye, telling what he sees and hears, even though he's technically a crew member of the Pequod and a character in the story. He involves himself in the work of the crew, but his story is not the main story of the book, and he is not the main character. Captain Ahab is. Instead of taking center stage, Ishmael does 2 things. One is to tell us the story of Captain Ahab's obsession with the great white whale. The other is to evoke, almost like a documentary filmmaker, the way of life aboard a whaling vessel. In the second half of the novel, in fact, much of Ishmael's narration is in effect in the third person. There are even scenes that take place when Ishmael isn't even present. In The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is slightly more important to the story. The character of Daisy is his cousin, and he plays a role in bringing Gatsby and Daisy together over the course of the book. Furthermore, it's Nick's voice that passes judgment on the events of the story, and it's his voice that sums up the meaning of the book in those famous final lines. But the main story is not about Nick. It's about Gatsby and Daisy. You could easily imagine a version of The Great Gatsby written in the third person, where Nick is just a minor character, and F. Scott Fitzgerald himself takes on the responsibility of passing judgment at the end. A variant of this type of first person is the first person plural narration, in which the author uses the pronoun we and adopts the collective point of view of a community of people. One of the best-known examples is William Faulkner's famous Gothic short story, A Rose for Emily, which is narrated from the point of view of the town itself. In this classic story, the first-person plural has the effect of drawing the reader in and making her a de facto member of the community. In fact, the complicity implied in the use of the pronoun we has the further effect of making the story's chilling ending even more shocking. The first-person plural isn't used very often, but it's still a technique that can generate interesting results. In recent years, the American writer Joshua Ferris wrote his first novel, Then We Came to the End, from the point of view of a group of office workers at a Chicago advertising agency. Now let's move along the curve of the sky as far down as we can go. Here, right down at ground level, is the subjective first person. In this point of view, the first-person narrator is one of the main characters in the story, and often the main character. Unlike Ishmael in Moby Dick, who is the narrator but not the main character, Huck Finn is both the narrator and the main character of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We see and hear everything in the book through Huck's eyes, and we can only know what Huck witnesses or hears about. Not only that, but Huck's moral journey is the heart of the novel, as he befriends the escaped slave Jim and decides not to turn him in to the authorities. In more recent times, as the subjective first person has become more prevalent, we have narrators like Ruth in Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping. Ruth is one of the three main characters in the book, and her decision about how she wants to live her life represents the book's climax. And there's the chilling Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's Lolita, who tells us of his illicit passion for the 12-year-old Dolores Hayes. This is one of the most disturbing uses of the subjective first person in all of literature. The curve of sky representing the different points of view is a continuum, of course, and these are just the principal compass points on it. Narratives can and do find points in between the ones I've just described. For example, a first-person narrator can be an unreliable narrator who lies or withholds certain crucial information or misunderstands what's actually going on. And many books mix and match points of view. In Anna Karenina and Middlemarch, both Tolstoy and George Eliot vary the scope of their third person. Sometimes they give us a wide-angle, omniscient view encompassing whole groups or communities of people. But sometimes they use the limited third person to get deep inside the head of a single character. Tolstoy, for example, goes so deep inside Anna's head near the climax of Anna Karenina that he approaches the extremely intimate third person you find in high modernist novels like Mrs. Dalloway. Some books jump back and forth between the third and first person. Dickens' great novel Bleak House is told from both the third person and the first person point of view. Even more recently, John Burnham Schwartz's novel Reservation Road has three main characters, two of whom we hear from in the first person, while the third character we see only in the close third person. When you're deciding on the point of view of your story, however, you're not just deciding who tells it. There's also the question of to whom the writer is telling the story, as well as the question of the time and distance from which a story is told. Let's take these one at a time. When I say that you have to consider to whom a story is told, I'm not talking about trying to decide who your audience is. That's a different question, and not necessarily an artistic one. Rather, I'm talking about a different question. Is your narration addressed to an unknown reader in the real world, or is it addressed to some one person or some group of people who exist in the world of the story? Take, for example, three of the most famous first-person narratives in literary history: Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Nabokov's Lolita. In the first two examples, the narrator is the title character. In Lolita, the narrator is the poet Humbert Humbert, and the title character is the 12-year-old girl who is the object of his sexual obsession. In all three examples, there are at least hints that the character is aware that he or she is addressing the actual reader of the book. Jane Eyre narrates her own story with great force and intimacy, as if she were writing her memoir for posterity. In the novel's single most famous line, she makes it clear that she knows she's writing a book when she says about Mr. Rochester, "Reader, I married him." Here you have one of the most memorable examples of a fictional character speaking directly to the real readers of her book, or seeming to. What's really happening, of course, is that Charlotte Bronte, a real person, is causing Jane Eyre, a fictional person, to speak directly to the reader. Or, if you prefer a more mystical interpretation, Jane Eyre is speaking through Charlotte Bronte. Huck Finn bridges the gap between fiction and reality in his very first sentence. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In this case, a fictional character not only speaks directly to the reader, he refers to a real book by the real author in which he, Huck, first appears as a fictional character. Again, of course, it's not really Huck, but Mark Twain, using Huck to refer to himself and his own earlier book. In Lolita, Humbert Humbert's first-person narrative is a little less philosophically complex. The book opens with an introduction by a fictional psychiatrist, and the rest of the novel is written as a confession of his crimes that Humbert Humbert wrote in prison. Unlike Jane Eyre and Huck Finn, who cross the divide between the fictional world and the real world, Humbert Humbert remains constrained within the pages of his book. He knows he's writing something that may only ever be read by the authorities who locked him away. The question of a book's intended reader gets even more complicated when you consider first-person narrators who speak in the present tense. We often find this kind of narration in thrillers. I walk into the room and pull my gun, that sort of thing. Such a narration contributes to the pace and immediacy of an exciting story, but there's something fundamentally improbable about it. Are we to understand that the character is silently narrating what he's doing as he does it? And then there are the first-person narrators of historical novels. Robert Graves' I, Claudius and Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian are fictional memoirs by real Roman emperors. We are meant to believe that Claudius and Hadrian are speaking explicitly to posterity, to readers who may live centuries after the author himself has died. The uses of the third person can be just as diverse. The 19th century third-person omniscient voice of George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy is very much a public, authoritative voice. While you wouldn't mistake Eliot or Tolstoy for each other, they share a certain godlike distance from the story and their characters. The voice of Dickens, however, is more feverish and engaged in the lives of his characters, even though he also often writes in the third person. There are also third-person narrations that presume the reader's intimacy with the social setting and the worldview of the author. Take, for example, the famous first line of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, Austen was an ironic writer, so presumably even she understood the hyperbole of this statement. Outside of early 19th century Britain, and a very narrow slice of British society at that, this is patently not a universal truth. But even if you don't believe it, the first sentence implicates the reader in Austen's world right from the very first words. Moving into the 20th century, you have the stream of consciousness third person of such books as Mrs. Dalloway. Much of that book doesn't feel as though it's speaking to anyone outside of Mrs. Dalloway's head, let alone outside of the novel. Even though the novel is technically in the third person, the effect of reading Mrs. Dalloway's narrative voice is like eavesdropping on a character's thoughts in real time. With a first-person narrator, you have to decide just how close the narrator is to the events he or she is describing. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is told mainly in the past tense, but that famous opening sentence is told in the present tense. You don't know about me without you have read a book called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. The clear implication of Huck's particular voice throughout the book is that he, the narrator, is still a boy, and he is telling us about a series of events that happened very recently. In other words, it's a story about a child told by the child. He's telling us about more or less contemporary events. It is a past tense story told by a present tense narrator, or a narrator who is speaking to us as we're reading. You get a slightly different effect from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The narrator of that novel is Scout, who was a child during the events of the novel, but who is remembering them from the perspective of an adult. At times, her narration is immediate and limited to what she knew when the events were actually happening. At other times, the novel steps back and narrates the events from the point of view of a grown woman, looking back on her childhood. In this respect, you might say we get the best of both worlds. A child's eye view of childhood, leavened with an adult's perspective on the events that the young scout would not have fully understood. It's a very subtle and sophisticated use of voice, and one of the elements of the book that accounts for its continuing popularity. In Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, the narrator announces herself in the first person, present tense, in the book's first line, "My name is Ruth." But the rest of the book is told in a retrospective past tense. Even more so than Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, Ruth is clearly telling the story from the point of view of a grown woman at a distance of many years. And in Thomas Berger's epic western Little Big Man, the narrator, Jack Crabb, speaks about events that happened a lifetime ago, including his friendship with Wild Bill Hickok, his days as a gunfighter, and his life among the Sioux. This gives his narration the quality of a tall tale. Among other things, Jack Crabb claims to be the only white survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and it helps define Jack himself as a talkative old man who loves spinning yarns. The idea of a narration's temporal distance from the events in the narrative is just as important with third-person narratives. The past tense is the default tense of many novels and stories, but the use of the past tense doesn't necessarily mean the events of the story took place in the distant past. For example, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is told in the past tense, but it was both written and set during the 1870s. George Eliot's Middlemarch, on the other hand, was published in the early 1870s, but it was set 40 years earlier, in the 1830s. Tolstoy is using the past tense to tell a contemporary story, while Eliot is using a similar past tense to tell a story of the recent past, giving the reader some distance from the events. If you transfer this difference to the present day, you can see that one use of the past tense is significantly different from the other. Consider the difference between watching the two television shows Breaking Bad and Mad Men. Breaking Bad is set more or less in the present moment, forcing the viewer to confront the fact that Walter White's desperation and increasingly bad behavior are a result of a way of life in which we all participate. Mad Men, on the other hand, is set half a century in the past. This distance allows the viewer to look back on Don Draper's lies and infidelities with the smugness of hindsight. Breaking Bad jangles our nerves because there's no temporal distance between the story and us. This is how we live now. But with Mad Men, we can at least cling to the illusion that we are better behaved than the people who worked on Madison Avenue in the early 1960s. So, as if choosing among all the myriad possibilities for creating character and sketching out a plot weren't complicated enough, you have to contend with all the complicated choices that come with deciding what point of view to use and which voice to use. Do you want to survey the landscape from a great height? Do you want to try and encompass as wide a view as possible, showing the whole scope of society while diving at will into the heads of a variety of characters? Or do you only want to look at that little patch of territory you can see at ground level from the point of view of a single character? Do you want to adopt the godlike authority of a third-person past tense narration that sees and understands all? Or do you want a first-person past tense narrator who can look back with more experience on her younger self? Or do you want a third-person present tense narration that relates events as they happen with no hint of what's coming? It's a lot to think about, so here's an exercise that might help you sort things out. Take the opening of any of the books I talked about in this lecture, or the opening of a book of your own choosing, or the opening of something you've written yourself, and try it in a different point of view, a different verb tense, a different voice. Would Huck Finn work if it were narrated in the third person? What if it were narrated by an elderly Huck looking back on his childhood? Would George Eliot be able to create as broad a portrait of the community in Middlemarch if it were narrated by only one character within the story? What would I, Claudius, feel like if it was written in the present tense? Would it make the Roman emperor's court feel more immediate, or would it just feel bizarre? I don't know if these alternate versions would be better or worse, but they would certainly be different than the ones we know. In the next lecture, I'll take a more detailed look at the first person, and I'll be talking again about Ishmael in Moby Dick and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. But I'll also be talking about unreliable narrators in the works of Henry James, Eudora Welty, and Mohsin Hamid. Then, in the following lecture, we'll look at the varieties of the third person. Each of these points of view has its advantages and disadvantages, and by exploring their use in the work of other authors, you'll be able to think about how to use different types of point of view and voice in your own work.